At our first romantic dinner, my husband excused himself to take a phone call. Moments later, an elderly woman from the neighboring table, someone whose face seemed vaguely familiar, wordlessly slid a thick stack of cash toward me and whispered urgently, "Call a taxi immediately and escape through the bathroom window." I barely survived with my own life. Hello and welcome to another story. Please let us know in the comments where you're joining us from today. Don't forget to subscribe to Clara's Stories and leave a like if you enjoy what you hear. Now, let's begin. But before all of this unfolded, the evening had been absolutely perfect. Almost ridiculously so, like something straight out of a Sunday afternoon romantic film. Lydia Brooks, a 36-year-old black woman, sat in the city's most prestigious restaurant, the Grand Oak Room, unable to stop smiling. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had truly arrived. Across from her sat Elias Sterling, her husband. Husband. What a beautiful, meaningful word. Only 2 weeks had passed since their intimate courthouse wedding, and she still couldn't quite believe it was real. "Lydia, why are you smiling like that?" Elias asked, his eyes warm and tender in the soft glow of the crystal chandelier above them. "Did I say something amusing?" "No," she replied, shaking her head as she sipped her ice-cold champagne. The bubbles danced pleasantly on her tongue. "I'm just looking at you and realizing how incredibly lucky I am." And it was the absolute truth. After losing both her parents 2 years earlier, Lydia had been completely alone in the world. She had her work, her beloved flower shop where she served as head florist and the heart of the small team. She had her parents' apartment, a cozy sanctuary in an older but well-maintained building downtown. But in the evenings, the silence in that apartment had become deafening, pressing against her ears until she could barely stand it. Then Elias had appeared in her life, tall, charming, 40 years old with lightly graying temples that suited him remarkably well. He'd walked into her shop one afternoon to purchase a bouquet for his mother and had simply stayed. Their romance developed swiftly, yet it felt completely natural, as if they'd known each other their entire lives. He courted her beautifully, eschewing cliché roses in favor of her beloved daisies because he understood that meant more to a professional florist. He listened intently to her stories about her parents, her work, her childhood dreams. He seemed so reliable, so genuine, so decent. "I'm the lucky one," Elias countered, placing his warm, strong hand over hers. "Finding a woman like you in this day and age is a genuine miracle. My mother absolutely raves about you. She keeps asking when we'll finally move your belongings to our new family fortress." Lydia laughed softly. They jokingly dubbed their future shared 2-bedroom condominium their family fortress. Elias was currently still living with his mother, Johanna Sterling, a woman highly respected throughout the city. She held an important position at City Hall and emanated an impressive mixture of composure and natural authority. Lydia genuinely liked her. Johanna had immediately welcomed her with warmth and maternal affection. The waiter, a young man with impeccable posture, refilled their champagne glasses. The restaurant manager, a substantial man in his 50s, had already visited their table twice to personally ensure everything met their satisfaction. He spoke exclusively to Elias, addressing him by name and regarding him with such obvious reverence that Lydia felt almost embarrassed. Elias took it all in stride, clearly accustomed to commanding respect in any room. "You know, I spoke with my mother earlier today," he continued, savoring his wine. "She's absolutely thrilled for us. She thinks I've finally settled down properly and that you're the best thing that's ever happened to me." It felt wonderful for Lydia to hear those words. She knew Elias had been in other relationships before her, but he never dwelled on details, only vaguely mentioning that those personalities hadn't been compatible. She didn't need those details anyway. The past was the past. What mattered was that he was with her now. Suddenly, his cell phone vibrated in his suit pocket. Elias retrieved it, glanced at the display, and a brief shadow of annoyance flickered across his handsome face. "Forgive me, darling," he said, rising from his chair. "That's business. very persistent people. I'll just step into the lobby for literally 2 minutes. It's quieter there. Go ahead and order dessert while I'm gone. The one with the raspberries, your favorite. He leaned over, kissed her gently on the forehead, and hurried toward the exit with elegant, confident strides. Lydia watched him go, admiring how gracefully he moved, how expensive and perfectly tailored his suit appeared. She smiled again to herself. Everything felt absolutely right. Everything was good. She glanced around the magnificent room. Wealthy patrons engaged in quiet conversation, soft classical music, the muted clinking of expensive glassware. At the table immediately next to hers, quite close, sat a solitary elderly woman. She was barely touching her food, simply stirring her cup of tea with a spoon, and for some reason, she was staring intently at Lydia. Lydia offered her a polite, friendly smile, but the woman didn't return it. Her face seemed vaguely familiar somehow. Where had she seen her before? And then it clicked. Of course. She was a regular customer from the flower shop, the sweet elderly lady who always purchased orange Gerbera daisies and whom all the girls affectionately called Gerbera Elsa behind her back. Elsa Miller, Lydia believed her name was. She was always so kind, so quiet, always thanking them warmly and wishing them a pleasant day. But now she appeared to be a completely different person. The moment Lydia recognized her, the old woman seemed to have been waiting for exactly that. She quickly glanced toward the exit where Elias had disappeared, then leaned heavily on her table and stood up with visible effort. She took 2 unsteady steps toward Lydia's table and bent down close to her. She smelled of valerian root and unmistakable fear. "Honey, listen to me very closely," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling like autumn leaves. Her face had gone white as paper, and there was such raw terror in her eyes that an icy chill ran straight down Lydia's spine. The woman reached into her worn handbag, pulled something out, and forcefully pressed it into Lydia's palm. It was a thick wad of bills tightly secured with a rubber band. "He's a monster," the old woman gasped, her icy fingers gripping Lydia's hand like a vice. "My daughter married him. She's not alive anymore. Do you understand me? She's gone. She vanished. Quick, call a taxi right now and run through the window in the restroom. Run, honey, run while you still can." Lydia froze completely. She sat thunderstruck with the bundle of cash burning in her hand, unable to utter a single word. What nonsense was this? What daughter? Was this poor woman simply confused? Had she mistaken her for someone else? "I think you have the wrong person," Lydia stammered weakly. "No," the old woman breathed, her eyes welling up with tears that threatened to spill over. "I am not mistaken. Run. Please run." She released Lydia's hand abruptly, turned quickly, and shuffled toward the exit as fast as her elderly legs could carry her. Lydia remained seated, staring after her in absolute shock. Her mind was in utter chaos. Was this some sick joke? An elaborate prank? But the money in her hand was undeniably real, and the terror in that woman's eyes had been absolutely genuine, not the confusion of dementia, but the desperate fear of someone who had witnessed true horror. She looked up toward the restaurant entrance, and at that precise moment, her heart skipped a beat, then began pounding wildly against her ribcage. Standing in the doorway were 2 men. 2 massive, bald individuals in dark, ill-fitting leather jackets that clashed dramatically with the elegant interior of the establishment. They weren't looking for a table or scanning a menu. They were slowly, predatorily surveying the room with cold, calculating eyes. And their gaze settled directly on her. Lydia had never seen these men before in her life. Elias had mentioned having cousins, but these intimidating figures didn't look like anyone's relatives. The threat was no longer the confused warnings of a possibly unstable old woman. It became real. It stood 30 feet away and looked her directly in the eye with unmistakable intent. Lydia stopped thinking rationally. Instinct screamed louder than any logical thought. She jumped up from her chair, grabbed her purse, stuffed the cash inside, and knocking over her chair with a loud crash, rushed toward the corridor where the restrooms were located. She heard someone gasp in surprise behind her. She didn't care. The ladies' room. She flew inside, slammed the heavy door shut, and immediately threw the bolt, then leaned her back against it, trying desperately to catch her breath. Her heart hammered somewhere in her throat, threatening to burst through. What was happening? My God, what was happening? A taxi. A window. The old woman's frantic words pounded against her temples like drums. She pulled her cell phone from her purse with trembling hands. She was shaking so badly that she dropped it several times on the cold tiled floor before she could successfully press the taxi app icon. Address. What address should she enter? Not home. Absolutely not home. The shop. Her workplace. The only place where she felt truly safe. While the app searched for an available car, she looked around frantically. The window was small and frosted, positioned high up near the ceiling. She climbed awkwardly onto the marble vanity of the sink to examine it more closely. Her heart sank like a stone. The window had thick metal bars set deeply into the wall. Her escape route was completely cut off. A notification popped up on her phone screen. A white Ford Focus, license number 730, was on the way. The car would arrive in 3 minutes. 3 minutes. She jumped down to the floor, her legs nearly giving way. She had to use the main entrance. No matter what those two intimidating men were doing out there, she would break through, run onto the street, get in the car, and drive away to safety. She took a deep, shuddering breath, desperately trying to muster her courage, and turned toward the door. But as she reached for the bolt handle to unlock it, she froze completely. Standing in the doorway, blocking the exit entirely, was the restaurant manager, Victor Sterling. The same man who had given Elias such a warm, friendly smile just 10 minutes earlier. Now not a shadow of that friendliness remained on his face. He looked at her coldly, with undisguised contempt. "Excuse me, I need to get out," Lydia muttered, trying to move around him. "I'm afraid you'll have to wait a moment," he replied in a calm, utterly indifferent voice, not moving an inch from his position. And then, from the corridor behind his broad back, she heard Elias's quiet, painfully familiar voice, the voice that had whispered sweet words to her just hours ago. "It's all right, Mr. Sterling. My wife is just a little worked up, tired after a long week. I'll talk to her myself." The manager nodded silently, stepped back from the doorway into the corridor, and pulled the door shut behind him. Lydia heard the most horrible sound of her entire life, a dry, metallic click. The unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock from the other side. She was locked in. She was trapped. And outside the door, she could already hear the approaching footsteps of her husband. Lydia ripped at the handle frantically. Once, twice, 3 times. The door didn't budge even slightly. Heavy oak wood. It had transformed into a prison wall, and beyond it, Elias's voice continued, so calm, so reasonable, as if soothing a hysterical child. "Lydia, please open up. What happened? You frightened me terribly." Then louder, addressing someone else. "Mr. Sterling, don't worry yourself. She just has a migraine. She acts like this sometimes when she's in pain. I'll calm her down right away." Migraine. He was lying. He was lying so easily and naturally that cold sweat began running down Lydia's back. This man, her husband, was a complete stranger to her. Everything she thought she knew about him, all that warmth, all that care, all that tenderness, it had all been an elaborate lie. The truth was the locked door, the intimidating men in the dining room, and the icy terror in the old woman's desperate eyes. Panic began flooding her consciousness, taking her breath away in waves. She looked around the restroom again desperately. White tiles, gilded faucets, an enormous mirror reflecting a pale, confused woman with frantic, wild eyes. That wasn't her. It couldn't possibly be her. Lydia Brooks, the head florist, the calm, sensible Lydia who knew how to handle every capricious flower and every demanding customer. She didn't get caught up in these kinds of nightmarish situations. This only happened in bad television dramas. She had to do something. Think, Lydia, think. The window was barred. The door was locked. Screaming, calling for help? But who would help? The manager was clearly working with Elias. The restaurant patrons would only hear his concerned voice explaining that his poor wife had a migraine. If she started screaming and banging on the door, everyone would simply think she was hysterical. They would be led away by those so-called cousins, put into a car and driven to. She didn't want to imagine what would happen then. Her gaze darted frantically over the walls, searching for anything, any possible leverage. And then she saw it. On the wall next to the door hung a small red box with a black button protected under glass. The fire alarm. For 1 second she hesitated. This would cause a scandal, a false alarm, chaos. But then she realized with absolute clarity that her life was already a scandal, and this alarm was the only thing that could possibly save her. The decision was instantaneous, discarding all doubt and hesitation. She wouldn't be a passive victim awaiting her fate. She would act. Lydia ripped her purse from her shoulder. It was heavy with a massive metal buckle. She swung with all her might and struck the protective glass with the buckle. The glass didn't shatter. It only covered itself with a spider web of cracks. "Lydia, what are you doing?" Elias's voice behind the door grew sharper, more commanding. "Stop immediately. You're putting me in an extremely awkward position here." Awkward position? She was losing the ground beneath her feet, her entire world collapsing, and he was worried about his social convenience? The rage gave her unexpected strength. She struck again and again with desperate force. On the third violent hit, the brittle safety glass shattered into tiny, glittering fragments. Without a second's hesitation, she slammed her palm down on the large red button. At that very moment, the world exploded in deafening noise. A broken, wailing siren blared through the entire building, making her ears physically ache. It roared and howled, bouncing off the tiled walls and filling every cubic inch of space with urgent, piercing sound. It was the most beautiful sound Lydia had ever heard in her entire life. Behind the door, there were angry curses and confused shouts. "What the hell?" the manager roared furiously. "She set off the alarm," someone else shouted. "Calm down, everyone. Everything is fine," Elias called out, trying desperately to drown out the siren's wail. "It's a false alarm. My wife is just—" But no one was listening to him anymore. In the corridor, there were suddenly hurried footsteps, frightened women screaming, genuine chaos erupting. That was exactly the chance she needed. And then a new smell joined the deafening siren, a biting, acrid smell of smoke. It was drifting in from the ventilation system. Apparently something had actually caught fire in the kitchen during all the confusion and commotion. But for Lydia, this smoke was a genuine gift from heaven. The panic in the restaurant reached its absolute peak. Now no one could possibly doubt that the emergency was real. "Open this door up immediately, you idiot!" someone shouted at the manager from the corridor. "We have a room full of people and there's smoke." Lydia heard the key grind roughly in the lock again. She stepped back quickly, fists clenched, every muscle tensed, ready to sprint the moment she had an opening. The door flew open violently. Standing in the doorway, his face red with fury, was the manager. Behind him, waiters scurried frantically and guests screamed in genuine fear. He tried to say something to Lydia, tried to grab her arm, but she didn't give him even half a chance. She shoved him aside with all her might and burst into the corridor like a woman possessed. The dining room had descended into absolute pandemonium. People were jumping up from their tables, knocking over chairs and expensive glasses. Women pressed cloth napkins to their faces against the smoke. The faint haze that had only been a smell in the restroom had already transformed into a translucent fog, hanging ominously beneath the ornate ceiling. She saw Elias. He was standing in the middle of the chaotic room, looking around in obvious confusion and growing frustration. He was searching for her with predatory focus. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In his gaze, there was neither warmth nor shame nor love, only cold, calculating rage that sent ice through her veins. He saw her clearly and took a determined step in her direction, but it was already too late. Lydia plunged into the panicked crowd, rushing toward the main exit, completely oblivious to everything in her path. She pushed and elbowed her way forward aggressively, ignoring indignant shouts and curses. "Excuse me. Let me through, please. I need to get out." Just outside, into fresh air. She ran down the grand marble staircase and greedily inhaled the cold autumn air that filled her burning lungs. The siren continued wailing behind her. Somewhere in the distance, the urgent sound of approaching fire trucks could already be heard. Lydia didn't wait around to see what would happen. She ran down the steps and along the street, away from that cursed restaurant. She didn't look back even once. She knew instinctively that if she turned around and saw him following, her legs would simply stop obeying her completely. She ran for one full block before she finally dared to stop. She turned a corner sharply, leaned against a cold brick wall, and tried desperately to catch her breath, nearly suffocating on her own sobs. Her phone vibrated in her trembling hand. A message from the taxi service. A white Ford Focus was waiting for her just ahead. She looked around frantically and spotted it by the roadside a little further down the dimly lit street. The driver, a middle-aged man with a tired, weathered look, eyed her with obvious surprise and concern as she practically threw herself into the back seat. "Young lady, are you all right?" he asked cautiously. "You look like you're running from something terrible." "I'm fine," Lydia gasped, still struggling to breathe normally. "Please just drive. Drive faster." She gave him the address of her flower shop. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb. Lydia leaned back against the worn seat and closed her eyes tightly. The adrenaline was beginning to subside gradually, replaced by an icy, hollow emptiness that seemed to fill her entire body. Who was Elias really? What did he actually want from her? And most importantly, most terrifyingly, what had happened to the daughter of that old woman, Elsa? "She's not alive anymore." Those haunting words echoed in her mind like a dull, terrible drumbeat that wouldn't stop. She remained silent the entire ride, mechanically watching the lights of the night city pass by her window like distant stars. She pulled the wad of cash Elsa had given her from her purse, counted out the necessary amount for the fare, and handed it to the driver when they finally stopped in front of her beloved shop. "Keep the change," she said quietly, jumping out of the car before he could respond. She froze before the familiar door. Lydia's flowers, her world, her sanctuary, her fortress. Every vase, every ribbon, every single flower inside had been personally chosen and carefully arranged by her own hands. With trembling fingers, she pulled her keys from her pocket, taking an agonizingly long time to hit the keyhole properly. Finally, the lock clicked open. Inside, it smelled beautifully of fresh soil, roses, and lilies, a familiar homely scent that usually brought her such comfort. She stepped inside quickly, locked the door behind her with all the available deadbolts, and turned on the dim light in the back room where she sometimes worked late. This was her true hideout now. A small, worn couch, an old wooden table, her laptop, and an electric kettle. She sank onto the couch heavily, and for the first time that entire evening, she began to tremble uncontrollably. She had to calm down somehow, pull herself together. She sat like that, hugging herself tightly for about 10 long minutes until the violent shaking subsided slightly. What now? Go to the police? And what exactly would she tell them? "Hello, officers. My husband locked me in a restaurant bathroom and an elderly woman gave me money and told me to run for my life." They would laugh at her dismissively, write it off as a marital spat, tell her to deal with it herself and stop wasting their time. She only had the cash Elsa had given her. All her savings, everything she had carefully accumulated over years of hard work, was sitting in her bank account. She urgently needed to secure that money, transfer it to another account, another card, anywhere Elias couldn't access it. She didn't actually know if he could access her accounts, but after this evening's nightmare, she was prepared for absolutely anything. She turned on her old work laptop. It hummed laboriously for a long time, taking its time to boot up completely. Lydia opened her bank's website with shaking hands, entered her username and password carefully. Her fingers barely obeyed her. She had to repeat the process several times before it finally accepted her credentials. At last, she was in her personal banking area. For one brief second, she felt overwhelming relief wash over her. There it was, her account. All her money was present, right down to the last penny. Everything appeared normal. She opened the Transfers tab with renewed hope and selected the option to transfer funds to another debit card. She still had an old payroll card she hadn't used in a long time, but she'd checked. Its validity hadn't expired yet. She entered the card number carefully, then the full amount, everything down to the last cent. A confirmation text message arrived almost immediately on her phone. She entered the security code in the corresponding field and pressed transfer, with her heart pounding. A loading wheel appeared on the screen, spinning endlessly. Lydia held her breath, silently praying. Suddenly, the wheel vanished and a red notification popped up on the screen instead. A small, neat window with just a few devastating lines of text. Transaction denied. Your accounts have been temporarily frozen due to a report of suspicious activity. The report was filed by your lawful husband, Elias Sterling. Lydia stared at the laptop screen in absolute horror. The red letters of the notification glowed mockingly in the semi-darkness of the back room, burning those words permanently into her brain. Lawful husband. That word, the word that had seemed so warm and reliable just one short hour ago, was now a brand, a steel trap snapping shut brutally on her entire life. He had thought of everything. He had calculated everything with cold precision. While she'd sat there happily and completely unsuspecting in that restaurant, he had already been taking action against her. He didn't just want to scare or restrain her. He wanted to completely neutralize her, to systematically take everything from her piece by piece. She frantically closed the notification and tried to perform the transfer again, her desperation mounting. Again she entered the card number, the amount, the text message code, and again, the exact same red banner appeared mockingly. Transaction denied. The coldness that had only touched her skin before now penetrated deep inside her, freezing all her internal organs. She wasn't trembling anymore. She was petrified, turned to ice. The flower shop was no longer any kind of sanctuary. He knew this place intimately. He knew she would flee here instinctively. It was the second place after her home where she felt safe, which meant he would come here soon, or he would send his frightening cousins to collect her. She had to leave immediately. But where could she possibly go? Only one address remained clear in her panicked mind. A place he theoretically couldn't take from her, her apartment, her parents' apartment, her childhood fortress. He could block her money and freeze her accounts, but he couldn't physically take away the walls she had grown up within, the home her parents had left her. She turned off the laptop abruptly, tucked it into her bag along with Elsa's wad of cash, put on her coat with fumbling hands, and slipped out onto the dark street, turning the key twice carefully in the lock of her beloved shop. The nighttime city was deserted and bitterly cold. She called another taxi, trying desperately not to look around, flinching visibly at every passing car. As the vehicle drove her through the achingly familiar streets, images of the past few weeks raced through her mind like a terrible slideshow. Here, Elias had helped her wallpaper the hallway. There, they'd laughed together, picking out a new couch for the living room. Here, he'd brought her coffee in bed just last Sunday morning, kissing her forehead gently. Each of those images, so warm and seemingly real, was now completely poisoned. Everything had been part of an elaborate plan. Every gesture, every word, every smile, every tender moment, everything had been a calculated lie leading up to this devastating evening. The taxi turned onto her street. The old five-story building, the sprawling maple tree by the entrance, all so familiar, so painfully known and loved. She paid quickly and leaped out without waiting for the driver to wish her a good night. Her heart pounded violently in her chest, but now it wasn't just panic. It was hope, desperate hope. Soon she would go into her apartment, lock herself in securely with all the deadbolts, and be truly safe. And tomorrow morning, tomorrow she would somehow figure something out. She had to. She ran up the stairs to her third-floor unit, taking them two at a time. There it was, the brown faux leather door, number 27. Her door. Home. She fumbled frantically in her bag and found her keys at last. Her fingers wouldn't obey her properly. The key ring slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor with a loud, echoing clang. The sound resonated through the quiet stairwell like a gunshot. She quickly bent down and retrieved them, selected what should be the right key, and inserted it carefully into the keyhole. The key wouldn't go in properly. It only went about half an inch deep before hitting something hard, as if something was physically lodged inside the lock mechanism. Lydia pulled it out, turned it over, examined it closely, and tried again. The exact same result. She tried the second lock below. Same story, completely blocked. This couldn't be true. It simply couldn't be happening. She pushed the key desperately into both locks again and again with growing desperation, completely uselessly. A wild, paranoid thought flashed through her mind. Had someone deliberately stuck matches or toothpicks in the locks to jam them? But why? Who would do such a thing? The panic she had almost managed to overcome returned with brutal, renewed force. She began to knock, first quietly, tentatively, then louder and louder with increasing desperation. "Open up! Please open up!" she called out, her voice rising. "Someone! Anyone! Please!" No answer came. She pressed her ear against the door and listened intently. No sound whatsoever from inside. Then she began hammering violently on the door with both fists and feet, abandoning all restraint. "Open up! This is my apartment. I live here." Her scream was filled with raw despair that echoed through the entire stairwell. At that moment, the lock on the apartment across the landing clicked and a door opened slightly, cautiously. Standing in the narrow opening was Tamara Davis, the neighbor Lydia had known literally since childhood. "Lydia, is that you?" Tamara asked, clearly confused. "What happened? Honey, why are you shouting like this?" "Tamara, I can't get into my home," Lydia gasped, turning to face her desperately. "The locks, they won't open. Something's wrong with them." And just then, slowly, deliberately, the door to her apartment opened from the inside. But standing on the threshold was not Elias. It wasn't a police officer or building maintenance. Standing there was a completely strange woman in her 50s wearing a faded bathrobe and worn house slippers. Her hair was carelessly tied up in a messy knot, and her face expressed extreme irritation and dissatisfaction. Behind her, the unmistakable smell of fried potatoes wafted out. "What do you want?" the woman asked rudely, sizing Lydia up from head to toe with obvious disdain. "Why are you making such a terrible racket in the whole stairwell? Have you looked at the time? It's nearly midnight." Lydia froze completely. She just stood there, staring in absolute shock at this strange woman standing in the doorway of her apartment, her home, her parents' home. She couldn't utter a single word. All the air seemed to have left her lungs. I live here," Lydia finally whispered weakly. "What?" The woman actually chuckled dismissively. "I rent here, sweetheart. And who exactly are you? I don't know you at all." At that moment, other doors throughout the stairwell began opening one by one. Old Mr. Nelson from the 5th floor peeked out curiously. The young couple from the 4th floor appeared. Everyone watched the unfolding scene with obvious curiosity and growing concern. And then heavy footsteps and voices were heard clearly from below on the stairs, coming up steadily. Lydia turned around slowly, her heart sinking. Two people were ascending the steps with deliberate, confident strides, Elias and his mother, Johanna Sterling. Elias looked appropriately concerned and distressed, the picture of a worried husband. Johanna Sterling was, as always, the absolute embodiment of composure and quiet dignity. A sorrowful, sympathetic concern was carefully etched on her refined face. "Please excuse this disturbance," Elias said smoothly, addressing all the gathered neighbors simultaneously. His voice was perfectly calm and utterly convincing. "Lydia is a bit overwhelmed right now. Overworked. A nervous breakdown, I'm afraid. We were just on our way to pick her up and bring her home safely." Johanna Sterling stepped toward Lydia with measured grace and gently took her arm. Her fingers, despite their gentle appearance, were ice-cold and surprisingly strong. "My dear Lydia, come along now," she said with what sounded like genuine maternal concern. "You don't need to make such a scene here. Come home with us. You'll rest properly. Everything will be all right, I promise. We're only trying to help you, dear." The neighbors, who had previously watched the situation with confusion and uncertainty, now exchanged knowing glances with each other. Of course, Johanna Sterling, such a respected woman, the deputy chair of the Metropolitan Housing Authority herself. She would never lie about something like this. And Lydia, well, yes, she had seemed a bit nervous and stressed lately, hadn't she? Probably really having some kind of breakdown, poor thing. The looks they gave Lydia changed visibly, right before her eyes. There was pity in them now, yes, but also suspicion, doubt, even a hint of fear. They were looking at her as if she might be genuinely unstable. "This is my apartment," Lydia screamed desperately, tearing her arm away from Johanna's grip. "From my parents. It was left to me. What is this woman doing here? This is my home." "Lydia, my dear child, you must be mistaken about something," Tamara Davis said gently but firmly, stepping out of her own apartment more fully. "You yourself told me you were having financial problems, some difficulties with debts. It's probably embarrassing for you now, but Lydia, to suspect such a respected woman as Mrs. Sterling of something improper? She only wants to help you, sweetheart." Elias sighed sadly, as if it pained him deeply to have to explain all this in public, to expose his wife's confusion. "Tamara, you're absolutely right," he said with perfect, practiced sincerity. "Lydia did have some serious financial difficulties recently. To prevent creditors from seizing her apartment, her childhood home, we temporarily transferred the property rights to my mother. It's purely a business arrangement, completely legal, designed specifically to protect Lydia's property while we work to resolve her debt problems. And while we've been sorting everything out, my mother officially rented the apartment to this lady here, so it wouldn't stand empty and deteriorate. Everything is completely legal and above board." The woman in the faded bathrobe immediately nodded vigorously in confirmation. Yes, exactly right," she said. "I rent directly from Mrs. Sterling. I have a proper contract and everything, all completely official and legal." This was such an outrageous, brazen lie that Lydia was momentarily struck completely speechless. "What creditors?" she finally screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "What debts are you talking about? You're all lying. I haven't transferred anything to anyone. I haven't signed any papers." Elias looked at her with deep, convincing sadness, the look of a devoted husband watching his beloved wife suffer a mental breakdown. Then he turned to his mother with obvious reluctance. "Mom, I didn't want to do this in front of everyone like this," he said with apparent genuine regret. "But I guess I have no choice now. She's leaving me with no other option." He calmly opened the expensive leather briefcase he'd been carrying and pulled out a neat folder. From the folder,